Welcome to EAI webinar. I'm Yul Sohn, today's host. I'm the president of the East Asia Institute and a Yonsei University professor. Today is the fourth and the last of EAI's so-called After Trump webinar series. Today's theme is U.S.-China economic decoupling under the new Biden administration and Korea's choice. A great economic decoupling looms large as U.S.-China economic relations are in danger. Tariff wars, trade divergent effects, tech attacks on Huawei and some other Chinese companies and industries. This is a profound challenge to not only two big powers, but also countries like South Korea. For Korea, China is the largest market, of course, and so there's a deep yet asymmetric economic interdependence between the two countries. United States is South Korea's military ally, but also it's a technological superpower with which South Korean economy has developed a highly interdependent relationship as well. So South Korea needs to accommodate China while at the same time affording support and engagement from the United States militarily and technologically. So any sort of decoupling along the line of U.S.-China rivalry will be a great challenge to South Korea. Now the Biden administration is coming. And we want to discuss if the current trend of decoupling change course, and if new Biden, if we see a return to pre-Trump normalcy, and what would be the China policy for the next administration, and economic regional economic architecture, and some implications. With that said, I'm very, very excited to introduce to you our guest, two great scholars in the field of international economics and international political economy, Dr. Barry Eichengreen and T.J. Pempel, both from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Eichengreen is the world leading economic historian and the foremost international economist today. He is the C.Pardee and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at Berkeley. He has written many important books, including Hall of Mirrors, Exorbitant Privilege, and Globalizing Capital. T.J. Pempel is Jack M.Forcey Professor of Political Science at Berkeley, a world-leading East Asianist with so many important books in the field of Japan, East Asian political economy, and East Asian international relations. TJ is presidentially appointed commissioner on the U.S.-Japan Friendship Commission and an active participant of the Northeast Asian Forum. His book, Regime Change, has been translated into Korean. And also his new forthcoming book will be translated very soon in Korean language as well. Last but not least, we have an excellent discussant today, Seung-Ju Lee of Chungang University, a leading IP scholar in Korea, and a Berkeley PhD, so we have a Berkeley party today. He also serves the chair of Trade, Technology and Transformation Research Center at EAI. He squarely works on political economy of international trade and new technology with regional focus on East Asia. For the audience, we are welcome to raise questions during the seminar. You use Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. And you can leave some comments to EAI staff also through to the EAI's official YouTube channel, the live stream channel. So let's get it started. Let me begin with a question to Barry first. In your most recent book, The Populist Temptation, you nicely delineated the historical processes by which economic insecurity combined with identity crisis led to destructive populist politics and policies. Can we make sense of the sharp fluctuations in the U.S. foreign economic policy for the past 4 years under Trump presidency in that way? And will we see a return to pre-Trump normalcy under the Biden administration? These are the two questions that I have.
So you've asked a very complicated question, I think. One thing I can put in simple terms is that we've reached the point of no return, I think, that in the sense that U.S.-Chinese relations have changed in a fundamental way. They can now change for the better, I think, but that's not the same as saying they will return to their pre-Trump status. My view of the explanation for those fluctuations in U.S. stance is they reflect partly fundamental economic tensions, what economists in the U.S. call the China shock, China's WTO accession, and the surge of exports to the U.S. and the rest of the world. But these shifts also reflect individuals and personalities. And here I would point not only to President Trump, but also to President Xi, whose rise to power and now firm grasp on power has changed the relationship as well. So there was discomfort before Trump over the intensity of Chinese competition. We in the US accused China of being a currency manipulator, not formally, but in so many words. Trump articulated that discomfort, I think. He framed the issue in an inappropriate way. He looked at the competition between the US and China in the same way a businessman might look at the competition between Samsung and LG. The market share of the two players, the US and China, is not what it's all about, but Trump did present the interaction as a zero-sum game and bring the discomfort to a head. He came along at a time when there was growing awareness of domestic problems in the United States, like the opioid crisis, and he could point to the decline of manufacturing in the US and the rise of China, rightly or wrongly, as a cause. I think his focus on an inappropriate concern, the bilateral trade imbalance, caused his critics to instead identify and articulate valid concerns like forced technology transfer, industrial espionage, inadequate intellectual property rights. China did its part as well, I think, by holding on to its poor country concessions in the WTO long after it was no longer a poor country, by its non-transparent belt and road lending to developing countries. With the advent of President Xi, it then became clear to American observers that the hope that engagement would lead to democratization in China or to something like democratization, that hope was disappointed. Assumptions needed to be revised, and I think the relationship will change permanently as a consequence. China has become more assertive and more nationalistic in its foreign policy, again requiring assumptions to be revised. China has become a foreign policy player to be reckoned with, causing security assumptions to be revised. That plays into the controversy over 5G. And now the United States has human rights concerns about China as well. And those are not going to go away. To the contrary, with the change in US administration. So the short answer to the question, will we see a return to, quote, pre-Trump normalcy now? The short answer is no. I think the new intellectual property concerns, foreign policy concerns, human rights concerns are not going to go away. Concern about China is now a bipartisan shared position in the United States. It may be one of the few bipartisan shared positions in the United States. All that will change is how the US seeks to advance its goals systematically rather than in a scattershot fashion, by building a coalition of like-minded governments rather than proceeding unilaterally on the basis of America first. I don't think the United States will build that coalition by joining that Trans-Pacific partnership. I think the Republican Party in the US has gone over to the dark side. It's become protectionist. Biden is a centrist, but he has to accommodate the progressive wing of his party, and that progressive wing is firmly opposed to trade agreements, including TPP. Biden may be more pro-trade. Janet Yellen is more free trade, but Biden campaigned against trade agreements back when he was going for the nomination. So I think the prospects for multilateralism are better than they were last year or in 2016, but they're worse than they were in the Obama years, because Biden or no Biden, the US is now viewed, understandably, as a less reliable bilateral and multilateral alliance partner. Let me stop there.
Thank you very, very nice. So you said that the source of change in trade policy from the United States and also from China too, and one important consequence of those changes is economic decoupling, as I mentioned earlier. Given the dangers of economic decoupling, question to TJ, can Biden administration push back against decoupling pressures and hopefully move to more nuanced China policy?
Yeah, I guess the way I'd answer your question is to start with a comment or two about just why this discussion of decoupling has taken place now, because up until a few years ago, really the most policymakers in the United States were pretty much committed to a win-win situation with regard to China, basically presumed that China would accept the broad outlines of America's global economic order, maybe with minor caveats here and there, that China would stay focused in turn on its hide and bide philosophy and continue its peaceful rise. And as we've seen with, and certainly Barry mentioned this, with Trump and the tariff wars, the attacks on Huawei, WeChat, TikTok videos, and the like, as well as the expansion of the treatment of China now by Pence, Pompeo, national security strategy as an existential threat. The situation has moved, it seems to me, in the United States from simply an economic problem to something that is being portrayed and painted as a much more fundamental combination of economic and security challenges that is quite serious. And of course, as Barry mentioned, Washington, D.C. now has really become bipartisan in its worries about China, and this is an issue that is going to be very difficult to address in what I think is a sensible way, because of the combined fears of China on both the Republican and the Democratic side. But of course, as Barry also mentioned, China has not been at all free of blame in this deterioration of relations and the focus on decoupling, with its emphasis on intellectual property theft, on decoupling from the rest of the global internet, particularly with regard to information that's available to its citizens, the banning of social media companies such as Google or Twitter or Facebook from access to Chinese citizens and the like. And of course, the human rights violations are combined with foreign policy expansions and crackdowns on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, and Chinese efforts to drive a wedge between the United States and many of its allies. The phrase that you hear now is in China is very much outdated Cold War alliance structures created by the United States. So all of this decoupling talk has, it seems to me, been exacerbated by the COVID-19 situation. Airline flights have been canceled, trade shows have been postponed, tourism is halted. We've seen investment flows drying up, high-tech exchanges have been truncated, et cetera, et cetera. Clearly, I'm a firm believer in the fact that decoupling and discussions of decoupling is extremely dangerous for the United States, but also for other countries. Most fundamentally, the two economies are deeply enmeshed with one another. You can talk about the trade relationship, but you can talk about Chinese investment in the United States, American companies investing in China. But even more tangibly, a number of U.S. companies and U.S. sectors are deeply enmeshed in the China market, and any kind of decoupling would be severely detrimental to them, whether you're talking about Boeing or whether you're talking about Qualcomm or whether you're talking about Tiffany's or whether you're talking about Starbucks or Iowa soybean farmers and the like. So numerous sectors of the American economy, numerous companies are just deeply dependent on the China market. And in addition, it seems to me, American universities are deeply dependent on Chinese students for a good deal of their income and for teaching assistants and the like. Some 1/3 of all foreign students studying in the United States come from China. And interestingly enough and positively enough, when I check the numbers, about 20% of the STEM graduates coming from China stay in the United States, wind up working for American companies, and in many cases become very powerful players in the success of the American technological breakthroughs. And lastly, I think it's important to recognize that there are numerous scientific exchanges between the two countries that are very positive and powerful, whether it's the WHO on pandemics or whether it's simply science and technology more generally. So it seems to me a realistic decoupling China policy, for the non-decoupling China policy for the Biden administration will not lead to a return to any pre-Trump era or some imagined ideal time in the past. I think it's necessary, and I think this is picking up on what Barry was saying, to move in a somewhat new direction. And I guess the starting point for me is to recognize that for the United States and for other countries, China is a challenge, of course, but it's also an opportunity. And I would want to suggest that there are basically 5 things that a Biden administration has to take into account in order to create a very effective China policy. First of all, it has to acknowledge the simple fact that Asia is the most dynamic economic area in the world. It's going to be that for the medium and long-term range. But in the short-term range, because of Asia's success in dealing with COVID, it's also going to be a very powerful engine of global economic growth in the short term. So any thought of getting out of Asia, I think, is ridiculous. But the second point that I want to raise for a Biden administration would be to say that without decoupling, the United States must still confront China's, what I call it, embedded mercantilism, but distorted economic practices, China's intellectual property theft, China's demand for access to global markets, while at the same time cutting off global access to its markets, promoting its SOEs, state-owned enterprises, providing incredible subsidies for that, and doing its best to nationalize the benefits of economic growth within the country in ways that play unfairly with regard to other companies from other countries. The third thing that's critical, and again, this is something that Barry said, but I want to underscore it, is the importance of multilateralism. There are numerous countries and numerous companies that feel very much like the United States does about the unfairness of China's practices. And I think it was a mistake for Trump to move into this America First mindset and think that that was the way to deal with China, when in fact, companies across Western Europe, in many parts of East Asia, are also anxious to confront China on some of these specific practices. And it seems to me that's a direction that has to be pursued. Additionally, I think the long-run strategy for the United States has to be to compete with China in a head-to-head way on the cutting-edge technologies. So the United States really needs to get its house in order on areas like advanced and 5G, on high-speed rail, on science and technology, on global warming, on moving toward renewable energies, on a whole host of things that China is now doing extremely well in, and that the United States has been very sluggish in, particularly during the Trump administration with the efforts to promote fossil fuel, and to return to an economy hypothetically looking like the 1950s. The fourth point, I guess, is that the United States just has to reject the Trumpian links to multilateralism and focus on alliances. But at the same time, I think the last point that I want to make is that the Biden administration has to recognize the tremendous damage that has been done to the United States image across the region. Countries are not just waiting for the United States to come and take leadership, because they've been through the changes that went from Clinton being positive on Asia, Bush being much less positive on Asia, to an Obama that was positive on the Asia Pacific, to now a Trump that was much less positive. And I think countries in governments and foreign policy establishments across East Asia are going to be scratching their heads and wondering what happens in 4 years. Biden may look very favorably on multilateralism, but is that going to change in 2024? So I think the long-term prognosis for U.S.-Asia cooperation is something that the U.S. and the Biden administration are going to have to work very, very seriously about. And I guess the last thing that the administration needs to think about in this regard is that Asia has been moving ahead with a lot of things in terms of multilateral institutions, free trade agreements, RCEP, CPTPP. All of these things are pulling countries together in ways that are going to be somewhat of a disadvantage to American firms, as American firms face tougher regulations or tougher tariffs than some of the countries that are now part of these FTAs and the like. The last point I want to make in regard to the United States is just the tremendous domestic obstacles that are going to be faced by a Biden administration. We first have the incredible economic problems that the United States is facing: huge debt, $3.1 trillion in the deficit right now, and that runs up against the fact that to make America competitive again is going to require huge amounts of money. It's going to require tax reforms. It's going to require a willingness to take on borrowing for long-term benefits. But that's going to run headlong into the protectionist sentiment that Barry correctly identified as being bipartisan as well. It's not just the MAGA Trumpists, but also a big wing of protectionists in the Democratic Party that are firmly convinced that globalization is the heart of the problem rather than technology, and they're going to resist efforts by Biden to improve some of the things that need to be improved in terms of globalization. And then finally, I think it's just important that foreign analysts and observers recognize the deep partisan character of the American polity these days. And so the Biden administration, regardless of what it's trying to do, is going to face a Republican establishment that is going to do its best to deny giving Biden any kind of victory whatsoever. The Senate is likely to remain in Republican hands. The courts are completely under the control of the Federalist Society these days. Many state governments are under tight Republican control. And for the most part, they're going to line up against any kind of changes in the tax structure. They're going to line up against many re-regulation of environmental rules, et cetera, et cetera. So for the Biden administration, it's going to be a very tough path to pursue. and it's not going to be very easy, and I think he's going to be facing problems both in Asia and in Washington, D.C. as he tries to move forward. So let me stop on that note.
Thank you. Thank you, TJ. The fascinating remarks, 5 points, but tremendous obstacles. Sounds quite frustrating. Now, let's turn to our discussant. Seungju, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, both Barry and TJ touched upon many issues, but I would like to take up 2 issues. One is about decoupling of supply chains, and another is about RCEP. Actually, of course, TJ also mentioned about the RCEP in a passing way. I would like to highlight some aspects of the RCEP as a second question. My first question is about decoupling, both because these days decoupling is a kind of buzzword these days, and in the wake of the global proliferation of COVID-19, the vulnerability of global value chains has been clearly revealed. That's one of the reasons why we are having numerous discussions about the restructuring of global value chains. At the same time, US-China strategic competition emerged as another factor that facilitates the restructuring of global value chains. So my question here is that what do you think would be the future trajectory of the global value chains in the coming years? How and how much do you think will geopolitical factors affect the global value chains reorganization process? And another related question would be that what kind of policy changes will Biden administration will make in terms of the Trump administration's decoupling policies? Also, do you think the Biden administration will continue to seek economic prosperity network as a means to induce cooperation from allies and partners, or it will be abandoned? And another related question would be that what kind of cooperation the Biden administration will seek from South Korea in the process of decoupling? That is my first set of questions. And the second question would be about the RCEP. As is well known, the East Asian countries finally managed to conclude the RCEP negotiations, which took almost 8 years. How do you define the primary nature of the RCEP? And what would be the impact of RCEP on the Asian regional economic order? And also, given that RCEP was understood as an initiative led by China, and the President-elect Biden made it clear that not China, but the US can write the trade rules in the 21st century. And also he made it clear that he will seek to strengthen cooperation with democracies in the region. So my question here is that what would be the primary nature of the regional economic strategy of the United States, particularly under the Biden administration in the coming months? And related question would be what kind of cooperation the Biden administration would expect from South Korea, particularly in redesigning the regional order after the RCEP conclusion. Let me stop here. Thank you.
So, Seungju, do you want to pose those 2 set of questions to both speakers, or do you want to designate each one to anyone? Well, sound, unmute, please. Unmute.
My first question is directed to Barry, and the second one is directed to TJ. Thank you.
So, great questions, but Seungju, you're supposed to answer them, not only pose them as discussant. I think the notion of decoupling is misplaced or mistaken. TJ put it well, the 2 economies are too interdependent for anything that, any picture that springs in your mind about what decoupling would entail to become reality. I think, Apple is going to continue to assemble iPhones in China under almost any conceivable circumstance. That was true through 4 years of Trump, and it will certainly be true through 4 years of Biden. I think the strategy, the goals of the Biden administration are to, on the narrowly economic front, to try to encourage China to continue to allow its currency to be more market determined, just as it has recently, to strengthen its intellectual property rights regime, to make clear that SOEs are not engaged in what we might call industrial espionage. And beyond that, there will be two-way flows of foreign direct investment into sectors that are not sensitive from a defense and security point of view. And I would expect that to continue. The question is, how will it go about trying to advance or achieve those goals? Number one, through engagement with China, which has not exactly been a strength of the Trump approach. Engagement, constructive engagement rather than antagonistic confrontation, and trying to get other governments like Seoul to be on the same wavelength in terms of pushing China in those directions.
Let me try to pick up one or two threads from that, and then move on to the question of RCEP and alliances and the like. I guess the other thing that I would add on the Biden economic policy for East Asia would be that my guess would be that Biden will continue to keep the tariffs in place that are there now. I don't think we're going to see those shredded very quickly. Much as you might argue against them, they do provide a powerful weapon for the Biden administration in its dealings with China. I think you're going to see, tariffs are not going to be continued on various of the American allies, whether Japan or Korea or elsewhere. But I think those on China are likely to continue, at least in the short run. But in terms of RCEP and other regional organizations, regional economic arrangements, my guess would be that the Biden administration is not going to join those simply for the simple reason that I tried to lay out earlier, that there's such a strong protectionist sentiment in the United States against these multilateral bodies. I think the multilateral approaches that the Biden administration will try to make will be much more along lines of APEC, the East Asia Summit, et cetera, where you can go out, you can schmooze with leaders from other countries, try to deal with multiple issues simultaneously, and try perhaps to press for greater liberalization. I think, though, that, as I tried to suggest, American companies are going to be at a singular disadvantage with regard to many of these minilateral or multilateral free trade agreements, including RCEP, because tariffs are being reduced or regulations are being reduced. I think Barry can probably speak to those much better than I, but my sense is that they're not going to be huge incentives for the participants to trade with one another, but they're still going to present substantial barriers to many American firms, as we saw with the TPP when it became the CPTPP, and the American government under Trump quickly insisted to Japan that the U.S. be given the same agricultural access to the Japanese market that it would otherwise have had if it was in TPP. Clearly, it was being disadvantaged in favor of agricultural products from Thailand or from Australia or from New Zealand, et cetera. So my guess would be that the United States is going to try to cut as many deals as it can for as many powerful companies as it can, but without joining those organizations. But I think we'll still see a planting of the American flag at these other institutions that America is part of, like the East Asia Summit or APEC or ARF. And I think there's going to be a lot more efforts to improve multilateral diplomacy with regard to North Korea, for example, and avoid the kinds of showboating and photo op silliness that Trump was engaged in with North Korea. That's not going to be an easy issue to deal with, and it's certainly going to be a lot easier to deal with if the United States can get along and get cooperation from South Korea, from Japan, and even from China.
Thank you. Before moving on to the questions from the audience, I have a couple of questions to you. One is that Barry just touched upon the issue of national security in trade, in economic policies. It's like it's about the balance between economic independence and national security. Here in China, yes, there are economic problems, like you mentioned, and also you can invoke national security in certain Chinese practices, like Huawei, backward vulnerability in the network as a whole. And also, Trump made it explicit that we don't want to China challenge the United States, so we want to slow them down and put every way of measures to slow down or deter the Chinese rise, etc. So all different the cases of protecting American interests. So how we differentiate or make it separate and have their own logics applied to a particular trade policy and muster support from your neighbors, your allies. For example, the third element that I mentioned, it's kind of protection for the hegemony competition. It's really hard for the countries like South Korea to accept and then take side with the United States. And also the national security clause, for example, Section 232, that apply to Korean steels and aluminum, and it's really hard to swallow. So how can we view this invocation of national security in a space of economic independence and trade, other economic relations?
So I think Trump's recourse to security concerns in order to slap tariffs on Chinese steel discredited, in a way, those security concerns. More broadly, I would say that good security relations and good economic relations go together. South Korea and the US have a strong trading relationship, in part because they've historically had a strong security relationship as well. My own work looks at financial flows and reserve holdings. Countries hold the currencies of their alliance partners as reserves. The economics on the one hand and the security relationship, the alliance, go together with one another. And conversely, to the extent that there are greater tensions in the security relationship between the US and China, that does spill over, obviously, into economic tensions, no doubt. You said one thing I kind of disagree with, which is that the goal of the United States is to slow down China's emergence as an economic force and a security force. I don't think we can slow China down. All we can do is to try to speed the US up. And TJ had some ideas about how to achieve that. Just for fun, let me modestly disagree with a couple of things that TJ said. I disagree with the point that the US is constrained by its debt because the interest rate on the debt is below the growth rate of the economy. And in my view, that's going to remain the case for many years now. going forward, which means that we can outgrow our debt and we can add more without creating a problem. I put complicated economics in a very simple way, but that is my view. The other point I would stress is that I think it's in terms of U.S. engagement with the world, it's the domestic politics in the United States that are the binding constraint, but in a different way than we've talked about so far. Re-engaging globally, re-engaging multilaterally, turning back the economic isolationist measures requires addressing the concerns and problems that led those measures to be adopted in the first place and created some popular support for Trump. Namely, we don't have an adequate social safety net in the United States. We don't provide access to health care for people that need it. We don't have an adequate minimum wage. We don't invest enough in preschool education. Is the Republican-controlled Senate, assuming there is a Republican-controlled Senate, going to go for any of that? And if not, the U.S. is not going to re-engage.
Let me jump in and just defend myself on one point that Barry made. I think he made perfect sense economically that it would make the U.S. should not be constrained by its debt. I fully agree. But I do think that the Republicans in the Senate are now laying the groundwork to say that, my God, we've got tremendous debt. Yes, we created it, but we can't put any more in play. Opposition to the continued financial and fiscal stimulus for dealing with the coronavirus problems, whether it's local government, whether it's PPE, stimulus checks, whatever. All of this is now being resisted in part because the Republicans are claiming that the debt is too large, we can't afford any more. So I fully agree that economically it makes perfect sense to borrow money and do infrastructure and do a whole variety of these things. But I think for political reasons, that's likely to be opposed. And I want to just make one or two more points very briefly. But I think that the economic and security links are certainly going to be very important. My guess will be that the United States will probably take a much lower profile with regard to its economics in terms of engaging with East Asia, trying to win friends and allies for tangible and specific targeting of problems in China. But I think the U.S. is going to be equally focused on trying to resuscitate some of the security alliances and to do its best to build up ties with South Korea, with Japan, with Vietnam, etc. But I would point out one more thing that I think I at least am starting to recognize, and that is that the Belt and Road Initiative and China's use of AIIB money is increasingly moving in the direction of Southeast Asia, Central Asia, around to South Asia, and in many ways this provides China with a way to advance its economic and security profile globally while avoiding the more touchy issues or touchy geographical spots in Northeast Asia that the United States has traditionally found its biggest partners in. So China will be in many ways not contesting the United States links to Japan or South Korea or even Taiwan directly, but it can expand substantially in areas where the United States has traditionally not been deeply involved.
Thank you. TJ, one question to you. Like I said before, Korea is economically dependent or asymmetrically interdependent with China. So that means that China has leverage to influence Korea's foreign policy in its favor. If United States, like Barry mentioned, for economic issues, urge South Korea to be in their side, which obviously contradict Chinese interests, then there should be a legitimate worry from Korea that China will retaliate with various economic means. We saw that in so-called the THAAD case in 2018, that Korean deployment of THAAD equipments to Korea, right, created huge foreign policy crisis and economic crisis here. So that's the case, and also we see. So in that sense, how if United States sort of trying to make a collective approach to China on various issues, if any of the countries in Asia, your friends, are in danger of retaliation, what would be the next step? What can United States and U.S. allies and partners can do, or some sort of collective approach to potential Chinese retaliation? And related to that, Japan last year, Mr. Abe also kind of followed Trump by making export controls, right, to a few semiconductor components to South Korea, and you invoke national security to justify that export control behavior. So that also is kind of related to this broader issue of national security. So,
yeah, I mean, it's a powerful and important question. Powerful and important question. And I guess I would simply say that China will do its best in every situation to deal with countries bilaterally, because 99 times out of 100, China will be the stronger of the two partners, the two negotiators. Certainly that's true in South Korea. It may not quite be true with Japan, but certainly it's true with all 10 of the ASEAN countries. It's certainly true with regard to Taiwan, etc. And so I mean, I shouldn't be giving cheap advice to Korea, but it seems to me that one of the problems that the Blue House faces is that it does allow itself to get boxed in on this bilateral relationship with China, rather than reaching out to probably ready allies, whether you're talking about Japan, and I know that's very difficult, or the ASEAN countries, etc. In my view, Korean policymakers spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about the Korean Peninsula as a territory unto itself, when in fact now the issues that involve the DPRK or possible invasion or possible security threats go much deeper, and at the same time Korea has potential allies in many other parts of the region. So I would love to see less focus on the Korea question and the self-absorption of Korean scholars and policymakers with what do we do with the North and how is everybody going to help us deal with the North, and start thinking a little bit more about what positive role can Korea play in the rest of the region, and how best can it cooperate with countries that will allow it to enhance its own bargaining with regard to countries like China. Japan plus Korea plus the United States dealing with China is a lot more likely to be effective on something like intellectual property rights, or pushing back against cutting off of particular key components, than Korea is ever going to be able to do by itself. So, that it seems to me is something. Korea has this look south policy now, which I think is probably a plus, but as I understand it, it's still largely focused on economics. And I think looking south would be something that ASEAN countries would welcome. Certainly Taiwan would welcome warm relations with Korea, and a little bit more effusive and expansive South Korean policy with regard to the rest of the region would probably be a plus. And if the Biden administration could do anything to facilitate that, I think that would be a plus. But clearly the first hurdle, as you and I know, is going to be just getting any measure of cooperation between Japan and Korea. You know, it's easy to cooperate with Singapore. The issues there aren't quite so deeply embedded, but Japan hasn't been the greatest player in this relationship either, but getting those two to look at 2021 instead of 1930 or 1925 or 1940 would be a plus in my view.
I would like to add one point about the possibility of China's economic retaliation on South Korea. Actually, this is not the like problems that only South Korea faces. Actually, these kind of problems actually widely shared with other East Asian countries. So I don't think the South Korea can come up with the one policy, or rather, I think it's going to be better for South Korea to come up with the kind of the combination of many policies to deal with the possibility of China's economic retaliation. So first one is that strengthening the bilateral cooperation with the United States would be the very useful means to reduce the possibility of China's economic retaliation. But at the same time, secondly, I think it's going to be very difficult, if not possible, very difficult to deal with China's economic sanction by resorting to bilateral relations or bilateral diplomacy. That's one of the reasons why we need a regional strategy or regional diplomacy, because there are many other countries in the region that share similar concerns with South Korea. So we better to seek a cooperation with those countries in the region. So we have to combine the bilateral cooperation with the United States on the one side, and as well as the regional cooperation on the other side. At the same time, lastly, we also have to deal with the we try to make an effort to reduce the structural limitations or structural vulnerabilities. That's one of the reasons why we have to proceed the reorganization or restructuring of the global value chains. So we have to approach this issue not in terms of the decoupling, but in terms of the diversification of the economic relationships or diversification of the global value chains. It's going to be a very useful means to reduce the Korea's economic vulnerability in dealing with possible China's economic sanctions. So my point here is that we have to combine various policies in order to effectively deal with China's economic sanctions.
Thank you. Thank you for your prescriptions for the government. Now, the audience question. I got a bunch of questions. One, this one goes to Barry. This is where you excels everybody. There's a looming currency. This question from Yong Lee, professor of Korea University. Looming currency competition as China is rising. You wrote sometime after 2008 financial crisis that there will be a multi-currency system coming. Do you still hold that position, and what's your prospect for the status of Chinese currency?
I do still hold that position. I've been predicting movement in the direction of a more multipolar monetary and financial system, and I'll keep predicting it until I'm right. I do think the United States can't provide safe and liquid assets all by itself to the rest of the world indefinitely, because the rest of the world will, to an extent, catch up to expand relative to the US. So there is going to have to be a more diverse supply of those safe and liquid assets. And just like biodiversity makes for a safer place, I think financial diversity will also. The question is where the diversity will come from. I think it will come first from Europe, because Europe is more open financially, Europe is more developed financially, Europe is having its mini Hamiltonian moment financially, whereas China has a lot more ground to make up. If you look at transactions through SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide International Financial Transfers, China accounts for 1.8% in the most recent month reported, where the US accounts for 50% and the Euro area for 30%. So the renminbi is coming as a global currency, but it is starting out way behind. China has a strategy for renminbi internationalization that suffered some setbacks in 2015, 2016. I think it remains committed to the goal in the same way that a first-class country should have an aircraft carrier and a national flag airline. It should have an international currency, the argument goes. And I think Chinese officials believe that. They're just going to have to be very patient.
Thank you. The question to TJ, Professor Pempel mentioned that one policy prescription for the United States in order to compete with China is there's a series of areas such as high-tech renewable energy where the United States is sluggish. Could you elaborate more on this point? How can the United States?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I start from the premise that the United States, particularly under the Trump administration, has been very slow to provide support for science and technology. It's focused very much on fossil fuels. It's focused very much on manufacturing. I think America's future is clearly going to lie, America's economic future is clearly going to lie in greater success in higher tech, in advanced industries and the like, much as China, I think, has recognized it with its Made in China 2025 logic. So the United States has to begin moving, for example, away from fossil fuels and into solar or wind or other renewable energies. We know that more jobs are being created in those sectors of the economy than in fossil fuels or in coal or anything of the sort. And I think it becomes, an important selling point for the Biden administration to make clear, particularly to folks in what you might think of as the red states, that if the United States can begin moving in this direction, there are jobs to be had for people who don't have a college education, who are capable of, installing solar panels or, raising towers for wind energy, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's also important to do more in terms of supporting the science that's linked to dealing with vaccine problems, dealing with World Health, returning to the World Health Organization, but bolstering the American scientific community. And I think the United States really has a great deal more to be done in terms of support for artificial intelligence and the like. So, it seems to me that America does not lack in ingenuity on these things. I think it's really a matter of putting a little bit more government shoulder behind the wheel. And a last thing that I think is important in this regard is, a change in immigration policy in the United States would be, in all likelihood, a very positive impetus for greater technology. We know the numbers in Silicon Valley, but a huge number of the startup companies there are formed by immigrants who come to the United States with not a whole lot of money, but an awful lot of brain power. And companies like Google are very dependent on immigrant workers. And I think all of that would be moving away from, it would be embracing Schumpeterian creative destruction, simply recognizing that the United States is no longer going to be a great manufacturing company. Some things should be manufactured in the US, but That's not where the future is going to lie. It's going to lie in services. It's going to lie in higher tech, etc.
Barry, let me just push you a little bit more in your book that I mentioned. The populist temptation. After the election, still you were saying, Trumpism after Trump or without Trump. Do you think that this, populist tendency will continue during the Biden administration
So the simple explanation for populism I offer in my book is that it reflects a pair of concerns. Number one, economic insecurity, and number two, identity politics, fear of the other, which is weaponized by certain politicians. As I said before, I have my doubts about whether we will effectively deal with the economic insecurity problem anytime soon, because doing so will require cooperation between the administration and the Congress. It will require the House and Senate to pass bills that either address the source of that insecurity or better provide the kind of compensation and adjustment assistance that people who are hurt by the destruction part of TJ's creative destruction are very aware of. I think we know how to address those concerns, and the issue is, do we have the political will to do so or not? On the identity politics, I think that really reflects fear of the other and the way that fear of the other is weaponized. We are now going to have a president who will ratchet down the rhetoric and try to counter the efforts of others who weaponize that fear, and that will be a positive, to be sure. Unfortunately, I think the addressing that concern more broadly will take time. I think about how to deal with these identity politics problems in my book, and I say, well, there's a lot of literature in sociology and economics and elsewhere that shows when people actually encounter immigrants, they grow less fearful of them. Or when they actually interact with people of other religions, they are less suspicious of them. So what can we do? We can promote residential integration, we can promote the integration of schools, and that will go a long way to solving the problem over a period of decades. In other words, it will take time for those attitudes to change, and that worries me, given where we're at the moment.
Thank you. Another question to you. China is on the way to develop its digital currency. How will this play in the relations among U.S., South Korea, and China?
I think not very much. China will be the first country of consequence to roll out a digital currency. And that will at least modestly enhance the attractiveness of using its currency, the renminbi, for cross-border transactions. But I also saw a survey of merchants in Seoul a couple of months ago, where they were asked, are you happy to take Alipay from Chinese tourists when they buy something from you? And everybody said, yeah, sure. And then they were asked, would you be happy to take a Chinese digital currency in payment for purchases by tourists? And they said, tell me first whether that digital currency would have a backdoor, whether it would be a mechanism for surveilling my transactions as well as those of Chinese residents. So I think more generally, every consequential international currency in history has been the currency of a political republic or democracy. That China is the People's Republic of China, but it doesn't have the checks and balances on executive power in place that would reassure people who might otherwise be tempted to use its currency, digital or otherwise.
I see. Thank you. I think this is going to be the last question to TJ. You mentioned mercantilism and Chinese mercantilism, or embedded mercantilism. You know, this embedded mercantilism in your book, we saw that in almost every phases of economic growth in East Asian political economies, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. So is it that the mercantilism that you mentioned is it just the same just stage of economic growth that we saw in the history of East Asian economic development, or is it just a different kind? I mean, is it really a different kind so that you need a different kind of approach to deal with this trend?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the success of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan did, in my view, rest very heavily on the fact that they could protect their domestic markets from a great deal of competition while having relatively open access to global markets. But I think the United States, as one of the leaders of that global liberal order, by the time the Cold War began to wind down, and I would start it in Asia with you know, China's moves toward accepting the Deng Xiaoping reforms. So it's, you know, you don't have to wait till 1991 for the collapse of the Soviet Union to see the Cold War breaking down. But the United States, for domestic reasons and global reasons, really began to push back against, particularly against Japan, but also against Korea in particular, and began to push for more openness, more domestic liberalization, for radical currency readjustments and so forth. For the most part, the United States has tolerated, and I guess the rest of the world to a large extent has tolerated, that same philosophy within China. And Barry put it in the context of China demanding to be treated as a poor developing country, when in fact its living standards are, you know, have vastly improved, and it's no longer in that situation. So my feeling is that that this is not just a stage that countries go through. It was one that was very deeply linked to America's, and to a lesser extent, Europe's tolerance of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. But the heavy dependence of all of their exports on the U.S. market made it powerful for the United States to not be pushing back. Now we're starting to see some pushback against China. And my sense is that China is going to be anxious to move toward more of a service economy. I don't know how Barry feels about that, but to move toward higher tech and the like, and move away from some of the low-end packaging and manufacturing that were endemic to its original growth. But I don't see ultimately China wanting to see non-Chinese at the heads of corporations, non-Chinese taking out big chunks of money, non-Chinese shaping the direction of the economy. I think the Communist Party wants to very much remain that final authority, and I think ultimately it's going to want to be able to cut deals with Han Chinese in the advance of the economy and do its best to prevent foreign intervention in any way, or foreign penetration in serious ways. And that, it seems to me, is where Western European countries, companies, and the United States and South Korea and Japan have a collective interest in trying to dismantle that economic policy, or the economic regime that's been so successfully advancing China's growth.
Thank you. Time's up. Actually 11:40 a.m. here in Korea. Let me conclude. Thank you so much, Barry and TJ, for your wisdom and intellectual power in commanding all the sorts of issues and questions. And also, I thank you, Sungju, for your great participation today. This is the fourth and final of after Trump series, and we have covered election and domestic politics of the United States, Biden administration foreign policy, and alliance between U.S. and Korea under Biden administration, and foreign economic policy today under the new administration. Rough conclusion is, Biden administration will see continuity and change, but not much more than expected in various aspects of foreign policy and economic policy. So though we, and also kind of common conclusion that the new administration will be stifled with the domestic politics sharply divided, politically, ideologically, and racially. So, we have very keen interest in China and Chinese development in sense of change, and also we really need to look closely into what's going to happen in the United States, politically, economically, and municipal policy. So with that said, let me conclude. Thank you so much. I still have many questions left unanswered from the audience, but I'm sorry about that. We are out of time. Again, thank you so much, and let me conclude. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks to you for organizing it. Thank you, Yul.
Thank you.